The Florida air was heavy with humidity on the evening of January 27, 1967. The Saturn IB rocket towered on Launch Pad 34, bathed in floodlights, its body gleaming white against a fading orange sky. There was no crowd gathered on the beaches, no engines thundering beneath the rocket. This wasn't a launch day. Yet inside the command module at the very top, 3 astronauts sat strapped into their couches, rehearsing for the mission that was supposed to open America's road to the moon. Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, Roger Chaffee. It was called a plugs-out test, a simple rehearsal to see if the spacecraft could run entirely on its own power. To NASA, it was practice, safe, routine. But in just 17 seconds, this rehearsal would turn into catastrophe. A fire would erupt, sweeping through the cabin, and before anyone could reach them, Apollo 1 would become NASA's first disaster. The fire, no one survived. How could America's most advanced spacecraft kill its crew before it ever left the ground? The tragedy began years earlier in the race for space. The Soviets had stunned the world with one achievement after another. The first man in orbit, the first woman in space, the first spacewalk. Each success humiliated the United States, a painful reminder that the Cold War wasn't only fought with weapons, but with rockets. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy set the ultimate challenge: land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. His words galvanized the nation.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
But inside NASA, they rang like a starting pistol in a marathon that seemed impossible. At the time, America had managed only short flights. Alan Shepard's suborbital hop had lasted just 15 minutes. The moon was 240,000 miles away. Yet Kennedy's promise left no room for doubt. Billions of dollars poured into Apollo. Deadlines loomed. Engineers worked around the clock. Corners were cut, flaws tolerated, risks accepted. Apollo 1 was to be the first full test of the new spacecraft. Its mission seemed simple: orbit Earth and prove the capsule safe. But beneath that simplicity lay hidden danger. The men chosen for Apollo 1 carried both experience and dreams. Gus Grissom, the commander, was one of America's original Mercury 7 astronauts. He had flown Liberty Bell 7 and Gemini 3, tough, blunt, respected, and deeply suspicious of unsafe machines. Once, to mock Apollo's design flaws, he hung a lemon on a test capsule. Edward White II was the nation's golden astronaut. During Gemini 4, he had become the first American to walk in space, floating joyfully in the void while millions watched in awe. That smile made him a hero, the embodiment of America's promise. Roger Chaffee was the rookie, only 31 years old. He had never flown in space, but he was brilliant and steady. For him, Apollo 1 was the beginning, his first step into the stars. At home, their families waited proudly, anxiously. Betty Grissom was used to the weight of danger, but still dreaded every test. Ed White's children boasted to friends that their dad had walked in space, but they were still too young to grasp the risks. Roger Chaffee's wife, Martha, barely in her mid-20s, was preparing for life as an astronaut's partner, never imagining she would soon be a widow. These weren't just astronauts. They were fathers, husbands, sons. And on that January evening, they were sealed inside a capsule that looked futuristic from the outside, but was a death trap within. The command module was packed tight, more than 20 miles of wiring wound behind panels. Nylon netting and Velcro strips held tools. Foam padding lined the seats. Even the astronauts' checklists were flammable. The atmosphere inside was pure oxygen, pressurized above sea level. It was meant to simplify design. Instead, it turned the cabin into a tinderbox. In those conditions, a tiny spark could become an inferno, and the hatch, the one way out, opened inward. To unlatch it took multiple steps and several minutes. In a fire, the crew would never escape. Gus Grissom had warned Apollo wasn't safe. He was ignored. The race to the moon didn't leave time for redesigns. What no one realized was that Apollo 1 wasn't just a spacecraft, it was a ticking time bomb, waiting for a spark. That afternoon, the crew suited up. They walked across the gantry in their white suits, waving casually to the technicians, and climbed through the hatch. The capsule was sealed, oxygen hissing inside. Hours dragged on. Communication crackled with static. Systems misbehaved. Frustration mounted. "How are we going to get to the moon?" Grissom muttered bitterly, "if we can't talk between two buildings." Outside, the Florida sun dipped, painting the sky in red and gold. Inside, the three men kept working through their checklists. Then, at 6:31 p.m., Roger Chaffee's voice cut across the loop. Urgent, sharp, unmistakable. The spark that ignited Apollo 1 was never seen. Some investigators blamed faulty wiring, others suspected a short circuit or even static discharge. The truth remains uncertain. But in a cabin filled with pure oxygen under pressure, the source mattered less than the speed. At 6:31 p.m., Roger Chaffee's voice broke through the loop. "Fire in the cockpit!" For a heartbeat, mission control froze. The test had been plagued with static all afternoon. Was this another glitch? But then came Gus Grissom's desperate shout, "We've got a bad fire! Let's get out!" Ed White lunged for the hatch. He was closest, but the pressure inside the cabin spiked as the flames devoured oxygen, pinning the hatch shut like a sealed vault. The bolts would not move. In just 17 seconds, the spacecraft designed to reach the moon turned into a death trap. Flames tore across the cabin. Nylon straps ignited in an instant. Velcro patches became firelighters. Foam padding turned into torches. The astronauts, weighed down by their bulky suits, had little room to move. Smoke filled their lungs. Temperatures surged past 1,000 degrees. The fire consumed oxygen so fast that the cabin became an inferno. 17 seconds. That was all it took. Outside, technicians rushed to the capsule. They could hear the crew's voices one moment, then nothing. Black smoke poured from seams in the spacecraft. Flames hissed inside. They clawed at the hatch, but it wouldn't budge. The pressure made it immovable. The men inside were screaming only seconds before. Now, silence. 5 agonizing minutes passed before rescuers forced the hatch open. By then, the fire had burned itself out, leaving only acrid smoke. The astronauts were gone. Inside, everything was blackened. Equipment melted, panels charred. The 3 crewmen lay motionless, their suits burned, their lives extinguished in the very capsule meant to carry them safely to orbit. News spread within hours. Headlines screamed, "Tragedy on the pad, 3 astronauts dead." The nation was stunned. Astronauts were supposed to risk their lives in space, on dangerous launches or re-entries through fiery skies. But this, to die in a test, strapped in a capsule that never left the ground? It seemed impossible. At home, the families were shattered. Betty Grissom, Gus's widow, would later recall the knock on the door, the words she already dreaded. She had long feared that NASA's rush to beat the Soviets would cost lives. She just never believed it would be her husband's. Pat White, left to raise her 2 children alone, could not answer when they asked why their father wasn't coming home. And Martha Chaffee, just 26 years old, had kissed Roger goodbye that morning, expecting him back for dinner. Instead, she was told she was a widow before her husband had ever flown. The cruelest irony was that the astronauts didn't die in orbit or on re-entry, but in the one place everyone thought was safe, the ground. The nation demanded answers. Congress opened hearings. The press accused NASA of recklessness, too blinded by the race to the moon. Inside NASA, the Apollo Review Board was convened. Engineers examined wreckage and transcripts, and the findings were damning. Wires with poor insulation routed dangerously. Velcro, nylon, and foam, flammable in oxygen, spread everywhere. The inward opening hatch impossible to open under pressure. And the pure oxygen environment itself, turning sparks into firestorms. The conclusion was clear. Apollo 1 had been a disaster waiting to happen. The spacecraft was rushed. Safety warnings ignored, corners cut. One investigator put it bluntly, it wasn't a question of if, it was when. The Apollo program was grounded. For nearly 2 years, no American flew into space. Engineers stripped the spacecraft bare, piece by piece. Every flammable material was replaced, wiring was rerouted, the oxygen system was redesigned. The hatch was rebuilt to blow outward, opening in seconds. But the greatest change wasn't in hardware, it was in culture. No longer could astronauts' warnings be brushed aside. No longer could engineers be silenced. The fire had burned arrogance out of NASA. From now on, safety came first. But a darker realization haunted many. If the fire hadn't happened on the ground, it might have happened in space, where no rescue was possible. The loss of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee scarred NASA. Their faces, once symbols of hope, became a reminder of fragility. Yet their sacrifice forced the agency to rebuild Apollo into something safer, something stronger. The fire had taken 3 lives, but it would save many more. The fire of Apollo 1 stunned the nation. For the first time, America was forced to confront the truth. The race to the moon would not be won by courage alone. It could cost lives. In the days that followed, grief turned public. Flags dropped to half-staff. Newspapers carried the astronauts' faces across their front pages. Television anchors spoke in hushed voices, telling the story of 3 men who never left the pad. The funerals drove the point home with brutal clarity. Gus Grissom, the tough veteran, was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, just a short walk from John F. Kennedy's grave. Kennedy had launched the challenge. Grissom had paid for it with his life. Ed White, the golden spacewalker, was laid to rest at West Point. Cadets lined the walkways in silence, saluting the man who had shown America its first breathtaking steps into the void. Roger Chaffee, the rookie with a career ahead of him, was buried in Michigan, surrounded by the same family that had cheered his every achievement. His first mission had been meant to begin his journey. Instead, it became his end. For their families, no flag or ceremony could soften the loss. Betty Grissom would spend years fighting to keep her husband's sacrifice remembered. Pat White, left with 2 children, carried grief that never left her. Martha Chaffee, barely past her mid-20s, was a widow before she ever got to see her husband launch. These were not just names in history, they were husbands, fathers, sons, gone in less than 20 seconds. And yet, in the cruelest twist, the very deaths that shook Apollo threatened to destroy it, and at the same time, saved it. The Apollo Review Board laid out the truth. The spacecraft had been rushed. Flammable materials filled the cabin. The hatch was a trap. The pure oxygen environment was fuel for disaster. But from those failures came change. NASA tore the program apart, then rebuilt it from the inside out. The hatch was re-engineered to blow open in seconds. Nylon, Velcro, and foam were stripped out, replaced with flame-resistant materials. Miles of wiring were re-insulated and tested again and again. Oxygen systems were redesigned so that sparks could no longer become firestorms. Yet the greatest change was cultural. Warnings could no longer be ignored. Concerns could no longer be brushed aside. Deadlines no longer came before lives. Apollo 1 burned that lesson into NASA forever. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. For nearly 2 years, America's rockets stood silent. The Soviets pressed ahead, fueling fears that Kennedy's challenge might be lost. But within NASA, determination hardened. Apollo would fly again, not in spite of Apollo 1, but because of it. In October 1968, Apollo 7 lifted off, the first crewed mission after the fire. Its success was proof that the changes mattered. 2 months later, Apollo 8 carried men around the moon itself, showing Earthrise to a world that had nearly lost faith. And in July 1969, Apollo 11 touched down on the lunar surface. Neil Armstrong stepped off the ladder and into history, followed by Buzz Aldrin, while Michael Collins orbited above. Every moment of that triumph carried the fingerprints of Apollo 1. Every redesigned hatch, every fireproof material, every extra safety check had been born from tragedy. Without Apollo 1, there may never have been an Apollo 11. And yet the question has never gone away. What would have happened if the fire hadn't come when it did? Would Apollo have succeeded, or would a greater disaster have struck later in the cold silence of space? The legacy of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee is not frozen in 1967. It is carried forward in every launch that followed. Grissom, the blunt veteran, proved that speaking up against flaws is as heroic as flying. White, the explorer, reminded us that wonder cannot exist without risk. Chaffee, the rookie, showed that even the newest voices carry weight in humanity's push into the stars. Launch Complex. 34 still stands, silent and weathered. On its cracked concrete rests a plaque, "They gave their lives in service to their country in the conquest of space. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 1. Those words are not just memorials, they are warnings, etched in steel and stone. The Apollo 1 crew never touched the stars, but their sacrifice lit the way for those who did, and their memory still shapes every step humanity takes beyond Earth. Because the story of Apollo 1 did not end in fire, it continues every time a rocket leaves the ground. If this story moved you, subscribe. Because the history of space is not written only in triumphs, it is written in tragedies that still shape our future.